And maybe that's for the best. I'm Adam Phillips, and thank you all for coming. This is the Jack Kirby Beyond Square Fingers panel. And I was really thrilled to invite these panelists to be with me. From the end, we got Walter Simonson. And then Karl Kesel. And right here, Mark Buckingham. And just quickly, I mean, I'm going to let you guys do all the talking, but I wanted to just say that I titled the panel Beyond Square Fingers because when I was a kid in the 70s and Jack Kirby came back to Marvel Comics, all my friends who read comics said, "Isn't he the guy who draws square fingers?" And, you know, we learned to appreciate him beyond that. But just to get things started, I was hoping the three of you could talk a little about not necessarily the first Jack Kirby comic you saw, because we've talked about, you know, everyone's talked about that, I think, and feel free if that fits the bill here. But the first one that really made an impact on you, that made you go like, wow. So take it away, anyone.
Why don't you start?
Start, Walter?
All right, sure.
Okay, you give me a lot.
All right.
Give me a lot.
I grew up in Maryland. Actually, I grew up in College Park, Maryland, which isn't that far from here. They did not have Marvel Comics distributed anywhere in the area, so I never saw Atlas Comics as a kid. I didn't see the early Marvels. My freshman year in college let's see, probably 60, well, I went there in 64. It's probably in 65. I was in a friend's room. He had a copy of Journey to Mystery 113, I believe. It's The Return of the Gray Gargoyle. I didn't know anything about, I hadn't really seen Marvel Comics. I picked it up. It was Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, and Chick Stone. Did the inking on it. And it looked very not much. I read comics. I was a big Duck fan. I read a bunch of Karl Barks that I could find. I read every comic. I just liked comics, so I read them all, whatever I could find. But I'd never seen art like that. And it was very striking. And that particular comic starts off with a shot of a giant Viking ship flying through the sky, full of Asgardians. Thor's riding outside the ship on the bow, sort of. I'm not quite sure that worked. But Odin's there, and they're going off to fight the mini giants or somebody, Frost something or others, some name they made up. I forget what they call them. But and then had a caption that said, "We promised old Jack Kirby we'd let him draw a couple of pages of action, blah blah blah, before we get started." And there were a couple of pages of action, and then they beat the guys in about a page and a half, or 2.5 pages maybe. Then Thor goes back to Earth, and then the story begins. But the time I read that, Marvel was by that time putting credits in their comics, but I didn't read it. I didn't, or at least it didn't register. And so my thought at the time was, wow, man, some kid named Jack Kirby wrote in and asked if they could maybe start off with this cool scene, and they said, all right, that's great, we'll do it. I thought, man, these guys are awesome. And then God knows how many years later, I was back rereading some of that stuff, and I got to that and went, oh, Jack Kirby, thanks, Walt. You know, I was like, oh no, really? But I love the comic. I had no idea what it was. I had been a Norse mythology fan from the time I was very young. My parents had a grown-up book about it, which I'd read and loved. And so I loved finding a book about Thor. I didn't care that he had blonde hair. I didn't care he didn't have iron gauntlets or a goat chariot. I just loved the fact that it was Thor and the Norse gods. And then within about 4 months, I discovered the only chain of drugstores near College Park that carried Marvel Comics. And so I bought Journey to Mystery 120, which was the first of a 4-issue storyline with the Absorbing Man and Loki, and it was fabulous. And if we have time, I'll tell you about that later, but no one's that now. But that was my introduction to Jack Kirby. It turned out I had seen little Jack Kirby earlier, a couple of monster books I bought out of town, but there weren't credits, I didn't know anything that was. But I got into Jack Kirby stuff instantly when I saw it. I became an immense Jack Kirby fan, and I was thrilled to buy it and keep track of the stories. Within 3 or 4 months, that was my entry drug. I was buying every Marvel comic they put out, so that was how it started. And that was, largely thanks to Stan and Jack that I started buying that stuff, and whoever was drawing it after a while. Of course, back then there were 11 comics a month for about 15 cents a piece, maybe 20 by then, 70, 65.
It's 12 cents.
12 cents, maybe.
12 cents.
So even in college, I could afford to buy all the Marvel comics that came out, and never regretted it.
Yeah.
So, so the first time, I started reading comics, in the late 60s, like 68. And I know I started with Fantastic Four about issue 80, which leads right into the famous Doctor Doom story where he takes the FF prisoners. It's a swipe of The Prisoner TV series. But I didn't know about that TV series, so I just really loved that story. But the ones that really left an impression on me was the annual that came out that year, which was about the birth of Franklin, and it introduced Annihilus, and it was really big and cosmic, and I was worried that Sue was going to die. And then at the end, I believe it's at the end of that when is that when they named Franklin, or is he only born? Anyways, in my memory, and maybe my memory is wrong, but at the end of it, they mentioned that Franklin's middle name is Benjamin,
Yeah.
and Ben starts crying. And even as a kid, that really touched me deeply. That moment really left an impression on me. And then, Fantastic Four was quickly becoming my favorite comic. And then they did the 3-part, The Skrull Takes a Slave. And I did not watch Star Trek, so I didn't know that basically Jack was ripping off a piece of an action episode of Star Trek. But I love the idea of alien gangsters. I just thought, and they ran a gladiator thing, and it was just this mash of ideas that it just kept brimming over, and I loved it. And once again, at the end, Reed and Sue and Johnny, they have a Skrull spaceship, they go find Ben, they save him, and it really became apparent to me the friendship between Ben and Reed. And once again, I was really deeply touched by that. And that's when Kirby's work, and quite honestly, obviously Stan Lee's work, that made a huge impression on me. That was, I think, one of those turning points with my appreciation of comics. I specifically remember 2 of the FF covers, the one where Ben's hand is tearing down the Ben Grimm murderer poster.
Yeah.
I love that cover. I remember sitting there looking at it at the drugstore going, this is like the best cover I've ever seen. And then the next issue was a sign, I believe there's no words on the cover, it's just Fantastic Four, and it's Ben fighting the robot gladiator Torgo, I think that's his name. And once again, it was a beautiful cover. And I even remember thinking, 2 Fantastic Four covers in a row, which are the best covers I've ever seen. And so Jack Kirby was really making an impression on me right at that moment. That's when I really became aware of it.
And for my part, I mean, obviously I was growing up in the UK, so our access to American comics was slightly different in that we had our own sort of Marvel UK that would repackage the American books in black and white as anthologies. So we'd get a sort of a newsstand weekly comic that would have about 40 pages of Marvel Comics material in it, and it would be taking stuff from 2 or 3 different issues of different books. So there was Mighty World of Marvel that had the Hulk in it, and I remember Daredevil was in there, various other things. And I remember there was, I think the one that really sort of resonated with me that I picked up first actually was when I came across Fantastic Four in there, and it was around the sort of early 40s, so it was Joe Sinnott was on inks, and they were starting to introduce the Inhumans, and Dragon Man and characters like that were sort of crashing through, and Maximus the Mad and Triton in a water capsule to keep them alive, and all this. It was just, I was reading this stuff thinking, this is incredible, and hordes of sort of his minions attacking the FF and all that sort of stuff going on. And I just remember at the time thinking, this is unlike anything I've ever seen before. And I was only sort of 6 or 7. So it absolutely blew that little boy's mind. I mean, prior to that, I mean, I think, the thing that probably appealed to me the most was there was a Spider-Man weekly comic that had come out as well around the same time, and the first issue of that had a free gift, which was basically a paper bag with Spider-Man's face printed on it, and it was sold as it's your free Spider-Man mask. So there were kids all over the UK running around with paper bags over their heads. But it was hilarious, but great fun. but yeah, the FF was the thing that really hit me straight from the outset, and you know, I mean, I've been a lifelong fan of that stuff and of Jack ever since. But of course, at that age, I wasn't really aware of the names. You know, you would fall in love with characters and with storylines, but you wouldn't really associate them with having been created by anybody. And I think I only really started to become more aware of Jack later on, when I started to actually then be able to access American copies of comics that would start to turn up in the UK, mostly coming over as ballast in ships. It was like, well, you know, we need to get the weight of the ship right, well, we'll just throw some comics in a corner, and that will kind of balance things out. So that would randomly then appear in newsagents in the UK. So I would just get odd issues of stuff. So I think I remember picking up like issue 3 of Eternals, and not necessarily realizing it was the same artist, but recognizing the same level of ingenuity and imagination at work. And I think that was the thing with Kirby that always absolutely took my breath away, was that mix of the dynamism and the energy of the work, but also just the sheer kind of imagination, just absolutely stretched to the limit. You know, anything was possible in his books.
Also, I will tell us a story brief. I don't give me the break, but one thing about Jack's stuff is it was so memorable. Maybe because it was so different from what everybody else was doing, so many people were doing. But when I read for the Journey Mystery 120, and then I found 121, and then I went back to college my sophomore year, and then I couldn't find any comics there. It turns out there was a tobacco shop that sold comics, but I didn't find that out for a while. And the end of 121, this fight ongoing between Thor and the Absorbing Man, is that Thor, at some point, right at the end of the story, Jack could really draw anything. And this little girl who hasn't appeared in the story ever before, but shows up conveniently at this moment. I didn't think about that stuff back then. Oh yeah, okay. She runs out in the street and Thor goes, oh no! And he probably in some Victorian English, picks her up and puts her over the side of the street so she won't get injured. And the Absorbing Man hits him in the back of the head with his giant ball. Whack!
That villain.
Evil guy, and Thor's lying there in the ground, and the Absorbing Man's going, ha! Only I, a guy as strong as Thor, could beat Thor. And it's like this big. I mean, I looked at those panels later, they're tiny.
They're tiny.
The ones at the end were tiny.
You always
But it was
squeeze it
still,
in.
but I remember that, and I thought, and of course, I'd only begun reading Marvel Comics like an issue before, maybe a couple of like stuff that friends of mine had. And I thought, oh my God, Thor's dead. Holy crap, what's going to happen next issue? What are they going to do? And so I went nuts, and I couldn't figure out I couldn't find the comics, I couldn't locate them. So finally, I wrote a desperate letter to Marvel Comics in New York City, which fortunately I do not have a copy of, because I'd be terribly embarrassed to read it now. But the gist of it was, you know, I read these two, thought they were fabulous. This is a terrible ending, I don't know what's happening. Would it be possible to buy a copy of Journey Mystery 122 directly from you guys, because I can't find them anywhere in the town I'm going to. And now, at the time I was going to college, I was in Amherst College in Massachusetts, which is a fairly prestigious liberal arts school. Why I was there, I couldn't tell. How I got in, I couldn't tell you. But I don't know if the fact that the fraternity dress was Amherst College helped on that score. So one day, weeks later, a manila envelope shows up. New York City address stamped on it. I open it up, it's a pristine copy of Journey Mystery 122 with a little pre-printed like blue card note, which is pretty, it just says dear blank, with a dear Walt, somebody wrote in. Thanks, let's hear from you, blah, 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 stand in the game. And that was all printed. And at the bottom was a handwritten note that said, Walt, couldn't let you down, hope you enjoy the comic. And I don't know if it was sign Stan or Stan in the gang, I don't remember that now. But, I was a Marvel fanatic from that moment on. Just like, there was no way I was not going to be reading Marvel comics for the rest of my life. Now it's the rest of my life, I'm not reading Marvel comics. But at the time, I read it. And I stapled it into the back of the comic book, thereby offending collectors everywhere. But I still have that comic, I still have the note. And one day, many years ago, many years after this, I went to the office one day because Flo Steinberg had come back to work for Marvel. Those of you who don't know, Flo was kind of Stan's Girl Friday back in the very early days of Marvel. She had left the company, she'd come back to work at the company. And we got to know Flo. She was great. She was a wonderful person. And I showed her the note, and she said, "Oh yes, that's my handwriting." Oh, all right. So really, I'm in comics because of Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and Flo Stein. And that's what But it was memorable, and a lot of it was memorable not just because of the story, but because of how Jack told stories, how he drew them, how he infused them with energy, and something you don't hear so much about, and I'll shut up after this. In the New Gods, the Fourth World stuff, there's a character, that's my favorite Kirby stuff, is the Fourth World War. It's not, in some ways, it's not as smoothly written as like a Stan Lee script. It didn't do as well commercially, but it's like Frank Miller, we were studio mates for a while. Frank said at the time, somewhere in there, we were talking about it, he said he thought it was like the first independent comics with those, because they were so personal, they were clearly so personal, and that personal quality carried the writing at a time when maybe it could have been made smoother, but they carried the writing in a way that just went beyond the comic you were reading.
Yeah.
So that Jack was able to do that. Well, he had a character named Kanto in the story who was Darkseid's personal assassin. And if you go back and look at it, where he affects Renaissance clothing, hat, costume, and so on. And people think of Jack as this, bombastic, everything, square fingers, giant action, all that jazz. Yes. But you look at Kanto, the acting of the character is just brilliant. Just bowing and gesturing, and it has all this kind of romantic Renaissance quality to the way he moves, the way his body is structured, as much as it's full of Jack Kirby's energy. He understood acting in comics in a way that he's not often given credit for, because other stuff's much more bombastic and more obvious. But one of the things about Jack's work that I've always admired and have tried to emulate is that ability to infuse his characters with personality. And that's something Kanto particularly stands out to me because of his costume and his action.
No, that's a great point. And I mean, this that I just put up here is sort of an example of it from the same era, of course. I was actually going to say that the next question was that, everything I'm hearing is, the power and the imagination and the overflowing ideas from one issue to the next, whether it's characters or situations. And I was going to ask about, are there any quiet moments in Kirby's work that jumped out at you?
Well, actually, I'll say something.
Yeah, please.
Because I was thinking about what are we going to talk about here, and I have to say, one of the things that stands out to me about Kirby's work is how he continually was totally at home with the street level stuff and with the cosmic stuff, and he would combine them in, like when the little girl is saved, you were saying. I mean, one of the panels of Thor that I remember the most is when he's sipping an ice cream soda.
Yes.
That's such a great, it's a splash page, I think.
Yeah, I think it is.
And the combination of those little moments with these big characters is, I think, one of the part of his genius. I mean, and it permeates all of his work. He does very simple costumes, like the Fantastic Four outfit, and then he does Galactus, which is like, who can draw that? Who can draw that every single panel?
Yeah, my favorite fans go and say, "Yeah, I like a picture of Galactus." I can't say now the words that cross my mind in public. I hear that. I mean, I don't mind doing it, but it's like, for God's sake.
But and speaking of, there he is.
Did the rarely seen
First
red
shot.
and green costume?
Yeah.
And I also loved how in his first appearance, and a few times after, he had a big G on his chest.
Oh yeah, that was great. I love that.
So great.
Also, it's funny. One thing Jack did is that his complex costumes were never the same twice.
Yeah.
Panel to panel.
Yeah.
Even the guy holding a gun, the gun might be different every panel. But one thing about the costumes to keep in mind, especially Galactus, if you look at it, as complex as it is, almost always the silhouette is the same.
Sure.
So besides those big aerials he's got coming out on the side of the helmet, but he keeps the silhouette pretty much consistent. And that's kind of what you identify when you're looking at it. You don't really think, oh, well, he had like 4 epaulets before, and now he's only got 3, or he's got whatever it is. It's the fact that he's able to, it's something from animation. I'm not Jack up in that, but that's, when I was reading up on animation, and I wasn't doing any, but a book I liked, it was about drawing. It was from an animator. He described keeping the silhouettes recognizable so that you would identify, the action and the characters and stuff. That's something else Jack did a lot with that, which is again not something you would think of most of.
Yeah, but I think that's also part though of the of getting to know your characters, of bonding with them and understanding them, and everything evolves in the process. So you will return to a character at the next issue and think, well, if only I'd kind of done that differently, or surely this costume would look better if I just lost that particular bit in the corner. And it's a brave artist that just tries to draw it better each time and is comfortable with making those adjustments.
I remember I was talking to Paris Collins one time at DC, and he said he just assumed that the Mobius chair was made out of this living machine, and that's why it was different from panel.
Oh, clever.
And I love that. I thought that was a beautiful insight.
Yeah.
That's great.
That is very cool. This is, of course, one of the presentation pieces Kirby drew. I don't even think he knew he was going to go to DC at this point. I think he was just sort of preparing for what he hoped would be the next thing after Thor. But speaking of which, I was going to bring up how, like, the lore about Kirby is sort of that even when it was an assignment he wasn't crazy about, he gave it his all. And I picked this page as an example of it because it was right at the end of his time at Marvel, and I don't think he really wanted to be drawing the Humans particularly, and this is one of the few things he wrote at Marvel before he left. But I mean, that is some crazy perspective, and it's so inventive to use things like that too.
Yeah, I think the word for Jack probably is fearless.
Yeah,
He just,
it's a great way to look at it.
Yeah.
he just did it.
Did you ever feel like there was a book you read that he wrote or drew that you're kind of like, his heart's not really in this? I mean, I can hardly come up with anything. Sorry.
I mean, there's just so many more that stand out. It's like I remember the ones that don't,
Like, and this is another example of a book, it's Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, and purportedly he came on there, he went to DC and said, is there a book that doesn't have a regular assigned team? And they said, yeah, Jimmy Olsen, and he dove into it.
Yeah.
I will say this is my favorite of the Fourth World books. I love Jimmy Olsen. And in fact, I own the original art to the next page in this story.
Wow.
Where do you live again?
I love Angry Charlie. He's such a great monster.
Yep.
He is so great. Yeah.
Well, that was what, I gotta say, that's the only time I ever read Jimmy Olsen on a regular basis.
Yeah.
I mean, as a kid, it was around when I was a child, and I would read it occasionally, and it'd be, Jimmy Olsen's turned into a Birdman, look, he's done this other thing. And I'm thinking, so here's a guy, Superman can move worlds and save, and so he's answering some kid with a little beep, beep, beep. I need my haircut. Could you get over here and get going? So, but the Jimmy Olsen, when these books came out, the Jimmy Olsens came out first.
Yes.
When the Fourth World came out, and I think 3 issues of Jimmy Olsen came out, and then I think maybe the New Gods came out. And what there were 4 titles, and they rotated bi-monthly. So each month, 2 of the titles would come out. So I think it was Jimmy and New Gods 1 month, Forever People and Mr. Miracle the next month, and back to something like that. And Jack did something in these books, this is speaking of his writing, that I haven't seen anybody else do. I borrowed a little bit when I was doing Orion for DC more than 20 years ago, but I only had 1 book, and I couldn't do 2 books a month the way Jack could. Is he created a patchwork storyline, a braided storyline, which is to say that there was this overall cosmic war. Didn't know that to begin with, and he would use each of these different books to show the war at different levels.
Yeah, it was brilliant.
So that you slowly developed a picture of what this war was about and how it affected this is why I wrote about it on the introduction to one of the books. But I thought that the New God showed the war at the highest level of the great warrior.
Yeah.
The Forever People were like the children of the great warriors, but war was still a great adventure. There's a great panel, full-page shot of Darkseid, of his head, and he's watching Orion do some stuff, and he ends up by thinking Orion knows that war is the cold game of the butcher. And it's not the romantic thing that the forever people,
Right.
but that's how they saw it. And that's how it read in that book. Then Mr. Miracle was the conscientious objector.
Right.
Now, this all was coming out when Vietnam was big in our lives, for those of us who are old enough. And that was a big thing going on, depending on did you want to fight in this war, did you not? What were your choices? I had friends that went and did everything, including go to Vietnam, go to Canada, get killed, all that stuff. So he's the objector who keeps getting kind of pulled back into what's going on. And Jimmy Olsen is the war at the earth level.
Yeah.
If you who are ordinary people, how it affects them. If you guys have ever, probably not at this point, anybody here ever heard of Doc E.E. Smith?
Sure.
Okay. This is kind of, he was a science fiction writer back in, pulp writer back in the, I'm going to say 20s and 30s, and he wrote a series of 6 novels called The Lensman, collectively called the Lensman series. And they are about how cosmic power, great cosmic powers are colliding, and it devolves down to Earth where bad things are happening. And then over each of the 6 novels, you step up to the next level of the cosmic battle until finally you're finding the Eurasians and the Eudorians or whoever it was, and their fight and how that was resolved.